Welcome to Wednesday Yachting Luncheon, live from the St. Francis Yacht Club. And we do have a beautiful view out these windows today. We're going to call that like 15 knots of breeze in the middle, 5-6 knots here in the lee of the Yacht Club. It's wonderful for us to all be here. And as Tommy just saw, we just remembered our member, deceased Gunnar Andersson. Thanks very much, Tommy, for putting on that little slideshow. I want to also take a moment to thank our good friends at Sailing Illustrated for helping us with this Facebook live stream. They do such a good job all the time. And first off, we want to introduce our Commodore, the historic first female Commodore in the history of the St. Francis Yacht Club, Teresa Brander. Teresa.
Thank you, Ron, and also thank you, Team Sailing Illustrated. We're here every week like clockwork, so thank you so much for that. And welcome members and guests in the room. Those of you who are tuning in online, we have a really interesting talk today. Looking forward to that with Captain Thomas, and really happy to be here. I've missed a couple weeks, but I'm back now, and so looking forward to today's presentation. And welcome again to the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon.
So let's see, future speakers and talks. You want to stop by in the Christmas season for December 19th's traditional father-son Christmas luncheon. Lots of entertainment. We'll have sea shanties. We'll have the knot tying contest. We'll have the Sons of the Sea. We'll have a whole series of entertainers. So that'll be lots of fun. In December 12th, Gary Jobson will be here to talk about his 19th book. There's really no better ambassador for sailing worldwide than Gary Jobson. We're pleased always to have Gary to our podium. So you remember the San Francisco waterfront. Movies were made about it. Books were written about it. And one such author, Lee Bruno, will be here on November 21st to talk all about Misfits, Merchants, and Mayhem, Tales from the San Francisco waterfront. Incredibly fun speaker who will talk about the colorful San Francisco waterfront. And also in November, Bob Heller, former governor of the Federal Reserve Board, will be here to talk to us all about the effect of tariffs. What about tariffs? Do they stimulate? Can they work? Do they work? How do they work? He'll talk all about those and interest rates as he gives us a kind of a view from the economist. He's a PhD economist, and he'll talk all about the economy and these other aberrations in the economy of late. Gene Bardi will be here in early November to talk all about the library of the Maritime Academy or the Maritime Museum nearby. And she'll bring by some first ever, never seen before examples from their library for us to look at. And next week, Tony and Landon will be here. They are the chefs, owners and chefs of the 30 Knot Gourmet. And you've been wondering, when we go offshore, do we have to eat this freeze-dried food? Isn't there some better fare? These guys have that answer. I remember one time sailing on a boat called Swiftsure with Cy Kleinman, and we were doing a watch change, and Cy was a gracious gentleman, and he's sitting at his table with his knife and fork in hand, and he's saying, "Where's my steak? Where's my steak? Where's my steak?" Everybody been served these beautiful New York steaks. And just then, we were about to go, I was a watch captain, we were about to go back up on the watch, but just then, the boat broached like crazy. You could just imagine up deck, boom up in the air, and across the cabin flew this New York steak and hit Cy right in the face and dropped in his plate. You knew Cy, he was just incredibly good with the one-liners. He paused for a second and said, "It's about time." That's a true story of Cy Kleinman. Let's see a little bit about today's speaker. He started as a 12-year-old water skiing in the Finger Lakes in New York. By 14, he remembers being on an auto vacation. We took those in those days, up to 1,000 islands. And when he was there, he saw in the Eisenhower locks this big bulker ship. And he thought to himself, wow, look how big that ship is. That looks kind of interesting. Wonder what those guys do in that ship. We could maybe go see the world. That was like the little spark that started it. At 18 years of age, he went to the New York Maritime Academy in the Bronx. At 21, he was a third officer on his first tanker. Since then, he's put in 5 100,000 miles. That's a few laps. And, stayed at sea all those years. His first commission as a captain at age 30 was with a 96,000-ton, 1,000-foot long fuel tanker, a crude oil tanker, as he remembered it. In '87, he came ashore and became the port captain for the maritime fleet for Mobil Exxon. And for the U.S., they had 35 ships that he was, 3 ships that he was in charge of, and 20 tugs. And he got promoted to go to London in '96, where he became the maritime superintendent for the entire fleet worldwide, 36 ships, 36 tankers. Then he was stationed in Melbourne and ultimately up here in Benicia after the ExxonMobil merger. We could not find a more authoritative person to talk to us about what on earth happens when a ship gets picking up a pilot outside of San Francisco Bay and comes in all the way through the gate, inside the gate, and to its berth. Then our speaker today come up and speak to Captain Craig Thomas. Thank you, Craig.
Thanks for that introduction, Ron. Thank you very much for coming, everybody. Yeah, I'll get started on this. One thing, a little disclaimer. When I do these talks, I'm not going to get into pilots, anti-pilots, what happened in that accident. I'm not going to, give my opinions on those. We talk a little bit about unions. I don't get into pro-union, anti-union. I know, they're no fun. So I just want to do that little disclaimer up front. So this is what we're going to talk about today on these types of ships. I'm going to move very quickly here to move through this presentation and give everybody a chance to read that very quickly. I want to talk a little bit about the regulations. People see these ships and they wonder, they're foreign flag ships, flags of convenience. What are the rules and regulations on these things that go by our front door here? So I'll talk about that a little bit as well. These are the type of ships normally that come in the bay. There's no surprises there, I don't think. Everybody will see those ships. Maybe the car carriers might catch people out. I'll talk about the car carriers that come in here with our Toyotas and Hondas. And there's one car that we export that they love, and that's the Tesla. The Tesla's one of the cars that you'll see them going back out. The Japanese, the Chinese, everybody loves the Tesla, it seems like. Yeah. So this is a typical bulker. It's just, maybe 5 open holds. They'll carry anything from grain to coal. Pet coke, which is an outgrowth of a refinery. If you run a refinery, you're going to have pet coke. You can make steel. You can make steel out of it. You can burn it for fuel. We don't do it here in the U.S. because it's dirty. But that comes out of here quite a bit with our refineries that are here in the Bay Area. There's a ship all the way up in Stockton. I don't think a lot of people realize up in Stockton and Sacramento the size of the ships that get up there. So this is a bulk ship. Looks like he's loading grain there. You can see him in Sacramento sometimes as you're driving and you're on Route 80 heading east, and just where it begins to split with Route 50, if you look to your right, you'll see some of these big-sized ships up there. Not the driver, but the passengers hopefully can look over there and you'll see these ships that go all the way up to Sacramento. This ship is a self-unloader. You'll see these come in the bay. You'll look at that big boom, which is part of the ship, and that will self-unload. What they bring in a lot here is rock. They'll bring in rock from Canada. They use it for concrete. It's supposed to be a special rock, so I'm told. And you'll see those self-unloaders come into the bay, and they'll even go down into the South Bay. This is a typical tanker. They'll have tanks anywhere from 1 to 10 cargo tanks. You have 2 types of tankers, really, just to be very generic about it. You have crude oil tankers that carry crude oil, and they feed the refineries. So you'll see them come through here with the crude oil, and they're going to Chevron in Richmond, Valero in Benicia, and they bring in the crude to feed the refinery. It's actually called feedstock in the industry, feeding that refinery with crude oil. They refine it, They make it into jet fuel, diesel, gasoline, kerosene, diesel, and they'll offload it into what they call a product tanker. And they sometimes call them a drugstore because they'll carry up to 6 or 7 grades. So you really have, just to be very, very generic, 2 types of tankers: crude oil tankers and product tankers. So there's a product tanker down in Anchorage 9. You can pretty much tell them they have a lot of pipelines. They're a little bit smaller. My goal always with this presentation is at the end of it, you'll know, looking at these ships, what the difference is. So they're normally coming out loaded, coming out the bay towards the west, whereas the crude oil ships are coming in, they can't take a full load in, they're so big, they're half loaded. We see a lot of these container ships, and in the industry they use TEUs, 20-foot equivalent units. So you see them on the back of tractor-trailer trucks, the CMA, CGM, Hanjin, Matson, and those are usually 40-foot long, and so those are 2 TEUs. And that's how container ships are measured. I sailed on a couple of container ships to the Far East, and they were, we thought we were the big boys on the block with U.S. lines, and they were probably about 4,000 or 5,000 TEUs. And now you're getting up to 25,000, 30,000 TEUs, these monsters that you see coming through the bay. There's one that I inspect. I'm currently doing flag inspections for different flags. This is a Malta flag ship that I inspected. You can see the size of this thing. Remember, they brought those gantry cranes in just fitting underneath the Bay Bridge back in the 90s. They fit by inches with the tide and everything. Those are getting to be too small, those cranes. They need to be bringing in bigger cranes for these ships. And again, from a recreational boater perspective, when you're on that wheelhouse and you're on that ship, you can't see over that bow. And you see them come across here, the container ship coming in, and the jet skis, the windsurfers. When they get too close, you can't be seen. And of course, you're not going to get picked up on radar. And of course, with a sail vessel, these things are so big, you lose your wind. A lot of people don't realize that. They're moving along at a certain tack, and the wind just dies, and there you are, you have this monster coming at you. The container ships, I just threw this up here, that they are on a strict schedule. You don't do this with tankers or bulk ships, but that container ship knows where they're going to be, what's that, probably about a month or 2 out. So the beauty about container ships is they have big engines and speed. So if they get in a storm and they have to heave to, after they get through that storm, they just crank, and they will be in Taranga on the 7th of April at 2100. They will be there. Here's our car carrier. So effectively, they drive these things on the ship. They lash them down, the longshoremen. And when they come in to Richmond and Benicia is where the car carriers go. Oh, I'm sorry, down in San Francisco, they're coming in here now as well, the Glovis ships. And the longshoremen go on, they unlatch them, and they drive them off. As I say, they used to go back empty to Japan or Korea. They're now going back with Teslas. So it's nice to see an export. Again, these things are they're a big sail. So I don't know if there's any pilots here today, or they're trying to maneuver these things that's trying to move a big sail and move a ship, thwart ships in and out of a berth. Here's one up in Benicia. Just that hydraulic ramp comes down on the stern, as simple as that. Cruise ships, we get the cruise ships in here. I do a lot of cruise ships inspections. I think everybody knows what they look like. What they may not realize is the cruise ships nowadays are fitted with azipods. And that's how they maneuver these ships. These azipods are like 2 outboard motors stuck through the hull, and they can pivot 360 degrees. So they're very, very maneuverable. As you'll notice there, the propellers are facing forward, not aft. So the maneuverability for these things, we're in the restricted waters coming in the bay, the propellers are facing forward. And then when they get out to sea and they're on their way, they'll pivot them around and put them aft in a conventional mode. Tugs and barges, we saw them. I saw one going out this morning. From a recreational boater perspective, right there it's pretty evident that you have that 2-inch wire tow line that's on a reel on the tugboat. As they get out to sea, they'll extend that wire so that the barge and the tug are both on a crest at the same time and in a trough. And so sometimes they'll extend that wire out even up to a mile. So there you are in your recreational boat, whatever it may be. There's a tug over there. There's the barge over there. And every year I read in the industry guide, the journals and things where a boat, just as they go through the middle, that wire comes up. So then you still have a problem. You're either in trouble or something like that, and here comes this barge behind you at 16 knots. So people die from that every year. As a recreational boater, you need to be aware of tug and barge and that 2-inch wire. A lot of companies have gone to articulated tug barges, and there it is there. You can see the tug in the notch of the barge. 2 hydraulic rams come out from the tug. They fit into the barge, and then as the barge rolls, the tug rolls with it. And if it pitches in the sea, it pitches up and down. They started in Europe, actually in Finland, and they're making the way into America. You'll see a lot of articulated tug barges out here, mainly Crowley, if you see the Crowley symbol on the tug stack. I put this in there just for a main engine, what it looks like on a ship. What they do on the container ships is they'll take two 6-cylinder engines and weld them together. So you have 12 cylinders on those container ships. They're massive. There's one, just for an example. So you'll have 2 of those welded together, usually with 3 turbochargers. You can see the turbocharger there on the right side of the photo. 3 turbochargers. Those things, as big as they are, once they get out to sea, they can move 25 knots, not a problem. There is a shaft on one of these things. So the engines is amidships. And so you have your thrust bearings. The shaft is so long that you have to put a bearing in there, otherwise it would wobble. This is your bridge of the ships these days. Gone are the days of the old-fashioned bridge. This is all electronic, everything. Electronic charts are now the standard. You have to have an electronic chart on the ships. You have to have a backup. So some of the ships have a backup paper chart, but many have 2 electronic charts. They're very sophisticated. All your firefighting, all your controls are up here. I put this photo in here of a container ship. Mainly people say, what happens to the containers? The containers are always falling off from a recreational boater standpoint. They do fall off occasionally. They do lay and lurk. I like the word lurk in the water. And so what they've done is gone with these cell constructions to help hold them in place. You can see the wires that are the diagonal wires that hold them in place, but that's how they lost them. So these new cell guides, which you'll see on the container ships as they go by, holds the containers in place. A typical galley on board. Any ship, let's go back to the crude oil tanker or the product tanker, you could have a super tanker. You've never seen a super tanker in here. They're up to 500,000 tons. I think the biggest that comes in here is maybe about a 180,000 ton crude oil tanker. So the biggest is 500,000. I've seen many, at Mobil we had 360,000 ton ships. They can't fit in the bay. But even on those, this is a cargo control room with all your pumps and all your controls for everything on deck. Same thing in the engine room. Gone are the old engine room days where you're climbing around, turning valves, all air conditioned, stereo system, some ships Wi-Fi, so they have everything in the engine control room. There's a standard cabin. Everybody has a cabin on the ship. That's a smaller mess room. All ships will have a rec room. Sadly, that nobody uses the rec rooms anymore. It's just like, here we are at home. All the officers and everything, they're on here. So it used to be in the old days, you couldn't even spell VHS or beta. So we would play cards, Risk, Monopoly. You'd get together off watch. You would enjoy it. Those days are gone. Everybody goes back to the cabin. Oh, sorry. Oh, yeah. They're all on the iPhone or the iPad, and it's kind of sad to see. Same as in general life. No comment further. We have to have piracy. Yep, piracy is still happening in the world, off of Africa, off of Singapore even. You'll have piracy, so the ships have to prepare for piracy. And when I do my inspections, I check their anti-piracy measures. We have to have a hospital on the ships. You're out in the middle of the Pacific or the Atlantic, you're not calling a helicopter in or anybody to rescue you. We'll have our own firefighting on the ships. We have to have our firefighting drills. This is on one of the cruise ships where I have to have a drill when I do my ship inspections. We'll have a abandoned ship drill. All the lifeboats these days are enclosed lifeboats. They're great for if you're stuck out at sea, but more importantly, especially on the tankers, is usually there could be a fire. You've had a tanker, the oil's in the water's on fire. In the old days, you get in the lifeboat, but you would burn. So these have sprinkler systems that will spray water over the vessel if you're on a tanker and there's fire in the water. So these are commercial considerations here in the bay, specifically in the bay. And the reason I like this slide here is a lot of people aren't aware of the Pacific Area Lightering Zone. And it's ship-to-ship transfer operations that take place as we speak off the coast of California, about 100 miles off of LA. So remember I said you had those big monster crude oil tankers. So you're an oil company, we'll pick on, I won't pick on anybody. You're an oil company, and you buy that oil from, a lot of oil comes in here from Iraq. We get a lot of Basra crude coming in from Iraq. So you'll put that on the big monster super tanker, 360, 500,000 tons. They can't make it into the bay. So off, about 100 miles off the coast of LA, the two ships will come together in a ship-to-ship transfer operation. The mothership, the large one, will steer a course into the wind about 3 knots, and the daughter vessel, a small 180,000 tonner, will come alongside. And it's very interesting because at some point as you're coming alongside, that daughter vessel has to overcome that bow wave, even at 3 knots. And at some point, the rudder can be over hard a port when you're 10 feet off this big monster tanker moving underway to overcome that bow wave. They come alongside, the mother vessel will keep her course and speed at about 3 knots. They'll put a hose over and they'll discharge into the daughter vessel. The daughter vessel will go into LA. LA's a deeper port than San Francisco. They'll go into LA, they'll discharge some crude oil there, feedstock into the refinery. She'll come up to San Francisco, whoever bought the oil here, Valero, Shell, Chevron, it'll come into that berth there and discharge the oil and go right back out to the Pacific Area Lightering Zone for another load of, that's happening every day, and I'm sure happening as we speak, weather dependent. There's a video on that, I didn't have time to show it, but if you go to ship-to-ship lightering operations or fender care ship-to-ship, you can find it there. It's interesting to watch it in action. So back to the Bay Area, what we have here, all the terminals that are here. Again, I'm always interested, Stockton and Sacramento, people don't realize how big those are. Those were big in World War II. Remember, we thought the Japanese were going to bomb San Francisco, and so they put a lot of the cargo up there in Stockton. It's an amazing, the amount of cargo facilities up there, all from World War II. And my other favorite is Richmond. Richmond's got all kinds of things going on over in Little Richmond. So there's our Carquinez Strait. They will load those tankers, the crude oil tankers. Remember, you want as much oil as you can get into your, let's pick on Shell, into your Shell Martinez refinery. So they will come in at the right tide to have at least 2 feet under the keel. And these ships are so big to have at least 2 feet clearing the Carquinez Bridge. The pilots will calculate that down to the inch with the tide. Here's our Oakland container terminal where they're trying to get, the bigger gantry cranes are going to be necessary to compete with LA and Seattle to hold, to handle these big monster container ships. I'm always amazed that one of those containers in the yard, in the middle of that mess, will find its way into cargo hold number 5, and it's a heavy one, in the bottom of the hold, because you don't want it on the top. At the exact moment, it has to be lifted on the ship. And then there's containers coming off the ship that are going into that thing, and they'll be on a truck within the day. It's just an amazing computerized ballet moving these containers. Maybe 3 gantry cranes at a time, moving these containers on and off a ship at a time. There's our Richmond. Just for a little tip for everybody in the bay, as you're going across the San Rafael Richmond Bridge, generally, the ship to the north, closest to the bridge, is crude oil coming in. Generally, the ship to the south, as you see there on the Chevron Long Pier, is product that's been refined going out. So as you're going across the San Rafael Richmond Bridge, you can say to somebody in the car, there's a crude ship bringing crude in, and see that one there, that's bringing product. You'll impress somebody. Same thing with the car carriers. The car carriers are either going to Richmond, up in the Richmond Channel, or up to Benicia. If they're coming into Richmond, they're normally Hyundais, Datsun, Nissans, and Kias. And Subarus, yes. The Toyotas are going up to Benicia. So same thing as you're going over the San Rafael Richmond Bridge and you see that car carrier turning to starboard going into Richmond, you could say, oh, here comes some Kias, Hyundais, or if it's going north, there are some Toyotas coming into Benicia. You'll impress somebody. So a lot of things ask, how did he get these careers? Ron talked about me on the ship. I just, was interested. I came in. It's amazing the jobs that we have here. You don't realize it, from the pilots to the guys and gals on the ships, to the longshoremen, truck drivers, terminal. I'm a surveyor now. I'm a ship surveyor for Malta, Liberia, and Marshall Islands. We have a lot of women in the industry. We get Turkish ships, and the Turkish ships have more women than I've ever seen, including captains, chief engineers at a high level. Very interesting to see. Well, and so here's a typical, everybody says, how many people on a ship? You can set your watch to it. All these commercial ships out here have about 21 people on it. From a recreational standpoint, so this is a normal watch standard on a ship. We call it a 4 on, 8 off. When you get to the articulated tug barges and a lot of tug barge units, they're doing 6 on, 6 off. So what do you say? You say, well, why does that bother me as a recreational boater? So the watches change at noon and midnight. They're both changing. 4 on, 8 off, and 6 on, 6 off. At noon, there's a watch change going on out on there. So when do accidents happen? A lot of times when do accidents? It's during or soon thereafter of a watch change. So it's just something as you're out on the boat, maybe you had a few beers or something like that, and there's a ship coming through at noon, you just need to be aware there's a watch change going on, no matter what commercial vessel it is. So this is how you get into the business. This is how I did it through New York Maritime Academy. You have the 5 maritime academies. We have one here, California Maritime in Vallejo. I went the deck route. You can go the engine route. Then you get your experience. As Ron said, I worked my way up to captain. You do continuous training. I did the little model where you sit in a little 16-foot model, and you have to maneuver that ship down the bay in a little model, dock it yourself with 1 rudder, 1 propeller, no tugs, and you learn how to move that ship around. Matter of fact, I did the course, and a week later, I was on the 96,000-ton ship anchoring down in Coatzacoalcos, Mexico, and it was a very crowded anchorage, and just came in there just very, very confident, maneuvered the ship around and dropped anchor. So we had all the regulations I talked about. Here's all of us that affect all the ships in the world. Internationally, we have the IMO controls everything. SOLAS came about after an incident on the Titanic. So they formed the IMO, and the first thing the IMO did is safety of life at sea, and their first rule of order was you have to have enough lifeboats for the number of people on board. Not only that, you have to have it on both sides of the ship. So that's what they started, SOLAS. Then came security, ISPS. MARPOL was oil spills. They started with oil, keeping oil controlled on board, air pollution, which is now fuel standards of training for what the license requirements are. And that's all of those are enforced by flag state inspections. So that's my job now for Malta, Liberia, and Marshall Islands, and Cayman Islands. I get to do the the super yachts. They build these super yachts so big that they're now coming under control of IMO. And in the U.S., after the Exxon Valdez, we had the Oil Pollution Act of 1990. We have our own inland rules of the road, as you all know, I'm sure, different from the international rules of the road. For example, one whistle means I am altering course to starboard in international rules. One whistle blast in the inland rules means I intend to alter course to starboard. So you need to know the difference on those. The Coast Guard does inspections of ships every year, port state control, and then I cover the flag state, which is done every year. California, we have our own things. We have fuel changeover. The ships used to burn dirty oil, very polluting with sulfur dioxides and nitrous oxides. So you had to change over. Basically, they're changing over to marine diesel oil, which is very expensive. And so they have to do that when they're 24 miles out from California. A lot of the ships now, you're going to see them soon, are LNG fueled. So you'll see the same old ships out there, but you'll see those 2 tanks carrying LNG. Which stands for? Liquefied natural gas. Thank you. Ballast. Ballast used to bring in nasty zebra mussels, all these things. So they required that pesky IMO said, hey, you have to exchange ballast at sea. So you discharge all your ballast, you load it again, you do it twice. And that's a ship discharging ballast, not cargo overboard. There's a chart showing how the ballast is loaded on and off the ship. That didn't work too well. They still wanted to go beyond that, and so now we have ballast water treatment systems where they effectively chlorinate the stuff coming on board to kill it. Comes in, now they want to discharge it overboard. You can't discharge chlorine over the side, and so it's treated again. So as effective 2017, all ships that are built new and ships going into their shipyard have to install a ballast water treatment system. So I finished with a quick visit into the bay, how the ships are coming in. There's the pilot station on the lower left, where the ships will pick up the pilot and drop him or her off on the way out. Here's a pilot boat coming alongside. A ship will make a lee for a pilot. What that means is in any weathers, the ship, if the pilot boat is coming alongside to the port side like this, as he approaches, the ship will make a hard port turn, hard left turn. And as that ship turns and goes through the water, it flattens the water out very nicely. If you have a good pilot boat driver, he'll come alongside at that instant. It only lasts for a few minutes, and the pilot will come alongside. Same thing when the pilot gets off. It's called making a lee on the ship. There's that pesky IMO saying that if you have a ship that's too high out of the water, you have to have the pilot ladder affixed to the side of the ship, so he's not hanging there like that famous painting where the pilot's hanging off, which is not fun for a pilot. So there's a ship coming in with an escort tug. So any ship carrying over 5,000 barrels of oil must have an escort tug that is tethered to the ship. It's not so much to stop the ship, but he can steer it somewhat under a certain speed. So if he's under 5 knots, if the escort tug pulls towards the port, the ship will turn to the right. California and Washington State and Alaska require escort tugs. So there's our crude oil tanker discharging through the Chicksan arm. That's a steel arm, steel pipe that comes on the ship so they can discharge quicker and more efficiently. This is a container. This is looking down. I throw that photo in there. It goes down and picks up the 4 bolts on the container and lifts it up. I just throw this one in here. Hamburg Sud, they still have some ships. Hamburg Sud is one of the only shipping lines anymore that will carry 12 passengers or less. You can pay to ride these ships. And the Hamburg Sud ships run around Tahiti, Fiji, New Zealand, Australia. They're still doing it, and they're one of the only ones left. This is one of the big monsters. There's the gangway going up, which is 5 stories. So I pride myself on not using the elevators when I'm on board, which is another 12 stories once you're on top to the captain's cabin. So after I climb on the gangway, I said, oh, yes, thank you very much, I'll take the elevator. This is over here in Oakland. It's the scrap steel. Somebody once told me this is one of our major exports is scrap steel that's coming out of Oakland. And that just gives you a sense on the ship how it's moved around with a bulldozer. It's going normally over to China to make steel. And there's our ship going out. You see those fenders on the side of the ship? There's 4 of them, 4 big black fenders. They do so much ship-to-ship lightering that they've affixed the fenders on them permanently. And they'll lower it over the side when they get out to the, in this case, Pacific Area Lightering Zone to unload the big mothership. So that's how much it's done. Okay. And that's it. I think I did okay on the time, a little over. And I guess we'll move over to questions now. Thank you. Take this.
Welcome again to our Wednesday Yachting Luncheon live from the St. Francis Yacht Club. Our guest today is Captain Craig Thomas. Captain Craig Thomas. So how many ships a year come into San Francisco Bay?
Oh, that's a good question.
That's not a good mic, though. Let's see here.
That's a good question. You can check on the San Francisco Marine Exchange. We're talking pure commercial ships. And I would say probably about 30 per month. I'm sorry, 30 per day on the list. I would say it's probably about 90 per month on average.
90 ships a month.
Yeah.
Now, those are commercial. What about tankers? What about passenger ships?
That would include the passenger ships, bulk ships, tankers, tugs and barges, all commercial.
Do all of those need a pilot?
No, not all ships will need a pilot. The U.S. flag ships, that they can carry their own pilot if he meets the qualifications, which sadly with the U.S. flag is a minority. So in general, I would say 85 to 90% ships require a pilot.
The pilot exchange at sea is a romantic, but also seemingly a kind of a risky proposition. When I'm sailing out there, I look up in the breeze and I think, holy cow, if, there's a 5-foot wave, 10-foot wave, the pilot ship comes alongside. Talk to us a little bit about the mechanics of jumping to the ladder and all that.
Yeah, that's a good quote, jumping. Yeah, as we sit here and we look at the weather today, it's very nice, but on other days, as you see the ships coming and going, it's very rough, windy, and not you don't want to be out there. And the pilots are still doing it. So what they'll do is they'll go out on the pilot vessel, the orange-hulled pilot vessel that you'll see go out, and they will go out and then get on the pilot boat to come alongside. As I say, the mechanics is the same everywhere in the world. The ship will make a lee. So let's say the wind is from the west. They'll agree ahead of time that we'll make a port side lee with the pilot ladder, and the ship will turn so that the pilot on the port side is in the lee.
Right.
And as he turns and flattens that water somewhat, the pilot will come alongside and hopefully not jump, but he has to make a big step. Because don't forget, if you're in a swell, as you make that jump onto the pilot ladder, this time it came up, let's say 10 feet. And as you get on that pilot ladder and you go up, the next time the swell may come up 12 to 15 feet.
Right.
So you need to move and get up out of that thing. And it's just as bad, to me, it's always easier getting on. It's the problem is getting off and making that step.
How fast are they? What's the standard for speed during the exchange?
They're probably doing just 10 knots as a nice round number.
10 knots.
You need the speed to make that lee.
I didn't understand the way you say they create a lee. Is it that the pilot boat goes into the curve or away from the curve on the outside of the radius?
He goes into the curve. Don't forget, as the ship is turning, he's turning,
Right.
but he's also sliding forward somewhat.
So that's where the lee is created. Okay,
That's where the lee is created. And that good pilot boat driver will come alongside and
So
get it
there's
just
less
right.
wave right in there.
That's right.
Well, that explains, because every time I sail alongside him going out to the lightship, I think, good heavens, am I glad I'm not jumping onto that ship right now from a pilot boat. Okay, so those who are worried about that. How fast, you mentioned that the ships were traveling 25 knots. What's the average speed of, let's say, a tanker out in the ocean?
15 knots.
15 knots. And what about a container ship? Any different?
They'll go slow speed. They try to go slow speed. They get caught in a storm because they're going across the Pacific or the Atlantic, and so they can go up to 25. They don't like doing that because it just burns fuel.
What's their normal cruising speed of a container ship?
About 16 knots.
And what about a passenger liner?
Passenger liners, same thing. That they'll do it slow speed, and they normally have it figured out when they're going to be in Ensenada and when they're going to, or Seattle or Vancouver. They've got it timed pretty well.
So at cruising speeds, what's the range of a tanker and or a container ship and or a passenger ship?
They'll usually, the biggest range is going across, let's say, the Pacific or the Atlantic. And they'll time that right. And they need to carry at least 25% backup fuel if they get caught in a storm. That's required.
So they have a cruising range of 2,000 miles. What would they have?
Oh, but the
4,000? What would they have?
4,000 over across the Pacific.
Okay.
Yeah.
And when they do the mothership to daughter ship fuel exchange, how long are they connected up for that?
There's no back pressure. It just flows very quickly. So at maximum 24 hours.
And so 24 hours to exchange, how much will they put across? How many?
They'll normally put it across about 500,000 barrels.
400,000 barrels. Wow. So now a little bit about the scale, the size of the ships. Container ships, how big are they? How long are they? What do they draw?
Well, we had the one here, I think the CMA CGM Benjamin Franklin, and I don't know what her exact details are on length. She's there at 1,000 feet, I'd say. What's amazing to watch, if you ever go over to Oakland and you go on those viewing platforms, the pilots will bring that in and then take it into the channel and turn it around with what looks to be about 10 foot on the stern and 10 foot on the bow as they turn that ship around. So they're just fitting in the turning basin over in Oakland.
So back to dimensions. How wide are they? The beam?
I'd say they're probably about 150 feet.
A beam? And what's a draft?
They'll go.
With
They're
their
not too drafty. They'll probably be about 35
feet.
40 feet maximum.
Is there a difference between the tankers and the containers and the passenger liners in draft?
Yeah, the passenger liners and container ships are sleek as you look at the bow, and they're not very deep, and they're made for speed. Where a tanker is just effectively a bathtub. It's just a big round thing, and just get as much oil in that as you
So
can.
the tanker is going to draw 35 feet, and what's a commercial passenger liner going to?
Well, remember they're all affected by the bay, so they can only really go to about 39 feet for given some tide action, but they're controlled by the bay here.
But the draft of a passenger liner, is that going to be the same draft?
They're much lower. They're I'd say
shallow?
26 foot. Yeah.
Okay.
You got to remember the tankers, the super tankers coming from Iraq, cannot take on a full load of cargo because you have to go through the Singapore Straits. They're so big that if they loaded full, they would go aground in the Singapore Straits, which is about 90 feet. So they had to load less than 90 feet. They can't take a full load.
90 feet of draft?
90 feet of draft.
Holy
So
macaroni.
it all depends what you're.
So you're saying a container ship could have 90 feet of draft? Or
The tankers.
A tanker.
Tankers,
90
yeah.
feet. And those don't come in our bay, right?
Not the big ones like that, no.
Right, because they've got most of the ones that we see around here are 30, 40 feet. How deep are they? What's the draft of the most?
Again, they'll bring that to 39 feet.
Yeah.
They'll figure it out, as I said, to the inch to get as much. All tankers, by the way, I should add, are double hull these days, and all companies require a minimum under keel clearance. So it always has to be at least 2 feet under the keel.
How many 40-foot containers will they carry?
The container ships now are getting up 20,000 TEUs. So that's
20,000 units. And how many cars will the car carrier carry?
The car carriers are getting big as well. The car carriers, I think, will carry about 4,000 cars. Depends what they'll carry trucks too. Trucks, tractors. Oh, that was another one I missed. John Deere tractors. John Deere tractors you see going as well.
So I'm going to ask questions until I see a hand with a question in our audience here. And we now have a couple from the web. Johnny's looking around. You're looking with the microphone. So after the question from the web, Julia, what do they want to ask out there in ether in the world? Yes.
No.
Good heavens. So let's see. Billy, you had a question.
I had a question. You do inspections of these ships. Would you talk about what the scope of the inspection is, how long it takes you, and are there some examples of controversies you've gotten into about whether you report something or not?
Yeah, the question is, as my flag state inspections, what's the scope of the inspection, how long it takes, and there was one other question. And the repercussions are
Are there some controversies that you've gotten into?
yes. Yeah, so I'll work backwards. Yes, there are controversies. I can detain a ship as a flag inspector. The scope of the inspection is I come on board and I look at the paperwork, both for the ship, the crew, their licensing, and then I check everything from the wheelhouse down to the engine room. We have a fire and boat drill, and so a lot of this life-saving and firefighting equipment must work. A lot of things must work. There's no if, and, or buts about it. And sometimes when that doesn't happen and it doesn't work, we will detain the ship. It cannot sail until it's fixed. I'm checking that they comply with all the International Maritime Organization requirements, which is SOLAS for life-saving, MARPOL, pollution. We do the fire and boat drill, and the Coast Guard is doing the same thing on the port state control inspection, exactly the same thing. It normally takes me on my own about 8 hours. With the Coast Guard, with 4 people on board, it takes them about 4 to 6 hours. So you get into to some interesting discussions on whether I'm going to detain the ship or not. Obviously, it's not good if the ship is detained. And the big items people always ask is the lifeboat engine won't start, the emergency generator won't start, the firefighting equipment doesn't work, or the fire line is deficient, leaking. In that case, then you're not sailing until those items are fixed. And then it will go into the other items. Somebody's license isn't as required on board, so you get into those discussions. You need to have somebody that can fit that position.
What's the economic impact if you hold a ship for a day?
Most ships run probably anywhere from $30,000 to $90,000 a day.
What's the economic? If you hold it back one day, it's going to cost them $30,000 to $90,000.
That's correct.
And who bears that cost?
The ship owner. Yes. So that's just, I'll give you a little mechanics of how that works. The flags are responsible for their flag ships, and you want to, if you have too many detentions, let's not forget, it's just not San Francisco, it's worldwide. And so that they have too many detentions, then they're blacklisted is what they're called. You want to be on the white list. So flags want to make sure they're doing a good job. And all the people talk about the flags of convenience, but they do work. The flags do work. They have good flags. So it's in everyone's interest that the ships pass the inspections.
So the bulbous protrusion underneath the bow of big ships these days. Talk a little bit about what that does and why those are on modern ships.
Good question. That's very similar to the airplanes. On the end of the wings, you have the winglets that helps in fuel efficiency. Same thing on the ship. That little bulbous bow that sticks up there, as you see on the ships, is breaking the water, and it helps with fuel efficiency.
Okay. I don't know why it breaks the water any more than just the bow, though. Do you know why?
That gets into
Okay.
aerodynamics. Same as the winglets on the airplane. I don't know why that little thing on the end of the wing is
Creates an end plate in that case.
That's right.
Funnels the air in the same direction.
Yes.
Okay, another question from the audience. Julia, and then we'll go out to the audience. Yes, Julia.
Don Lunabus, who used to work for Grace Lines and Johnson Line, has two questions. And after seeing the steel going out, he asked if that was Schnitzer steel. When I don't know what that is.
The answer is yes, that's Schnitzer Steel. Yes, over in Oakland.
Okay.
What does that mean?
That's a company.
That's a company.
Huge
All right.
company for scrap steel. Huge.
And then will traffic increase with tariffs based on smaller cargo?
That is a very good question. I don't know. I think I'd like to go to the discussion that you're
Bob
having
Heller.
in a few weeks. I don't know the answer
Yeah.
to that.
Thank you. That's it.
So, the number of crew on these ships, you mentioned 25 or so. Talk to me about the crew for a tanker, a typical crew for a container, typical crew for a passenger ship, which has got to be way more. But
I'll do the container and the tanker first. They're usually about 21. The car carrier, the tankers, the bulk ships, 21 people, plus or minus a few. The cruise ships are sometimes close to 1,000 crew because you have the waiting staff, the restaurant staff, the hotel staff. But even the seagoing staff is usually up around 40. They're quite heavy.
so in a 20-person crew, is that divided into 2 crews or 3 crews? How do you organize the cruise ships?
They normally do a 3 crew, so you do the 4 on, 8 off. So you're on the 8 to 12, 12 to 4, or 4 to 8 is how they do it on the ships.
Got it. Yes, another question in the audience. Yes.
Hi.
From the DeWitt table, I know.
Can you talk a little bit about the marks on the side of the ships?
Good question. Good. Samuel Plimsoll. I forget the year. Let's go with the 1800s. I think that was right. So they used to overload ships. They would go to sea. They would sink, and the insurers would lose everything. So Samuel Plimsoll came along with the Plimsoll mark, and that's the mark you see midships. And you have the basic Plimsoll mark. That is your saltwater Plimsoll mark. You cannot load above that line. But there's several. There's a few other markers there. If you're in fresh water, you can go deeper, of course, because when you're in salt water, you're going to float a little bit more. You have your winter lines if you're in ice areas. But the main line is normally the summer draft. It'll say on it, if you look at a ship closely, S, and then there's a circle with a line through it. Basically, you should never see a vessel, a barge, a ship, anything loaded above and beyond that line. It still works. To me, it's a thing of beauty, the Plimsoll mark. I'm surprised you don't see more artists of it, but it still works from the 1800s, and it's something you can look at very quickly and know that the ship is complying with its load line requirements.
So how tall are the highest container ships? They seem amazingly close to the bridge when they go out.
When you're on the deck, it's another 10 stories up to the
10
bridge.
stories above the deck. And the distance from the deck to the waterline?
And that's probably about 5 stories.
So 15 stories, 150 feet or so.
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah.
And which are the ships that come closest to touching the 220-foot bottom of the Golden Gate Bridge?
I would say those container ships are getting closer, getting bigger.
So we hear as sailors all the time, we're always kind of a little worried that in the middle of the night, we're in the Molokai Channel and we might see a container. We're always looking out for containers. But actually, what's the raw number of containers that fall overboard in a year? Is there a measure of that?
There probably is. I'd have to look at the internet and throw out a number. I don't know. They are getting better at it, as I said, with the cell guides holding these containers in because they don't want them to go overboard. And well, nobody does. It still happens on occasion, and people need to be aware of it. But
is there a built-in plug that is water soluble that ultimately dissolves so that it'll sink after some length of time in the water?
I'm not aware of that. I don't think so. That's a great idea, I think.
Okay. When you patent that, you'll call me for
Yeah,
sure.
yeah. I think I'm
I hope
take
so.
notes myself.
Another question out here. Yes, sir. Jimmy DeWitt.
I'm an old man. I have a friend that helped design that big bulb in the front of the ship, and I asked him what it was all about. I barely understood him, but it changed the bow wave. It changed the wave that the boat goes through, and it saves gas. The other one is, who has a minority or who makes most of these ships?
Yeah, most ships these days are built in Japan, Korea, and China. That's pretty much it. The U.S. we still build some. As I say, the U.S. merchant marine is a small minority, but Korea, China, and Japan.
So how big are those anchors? How heavy are those anchors that we see in these ships?
The anchors, well, I was going to say they're not that big, but they're quite large. They'll be a few tons, 5 tons, the anchor themselves.
5 tons?
Yes.
10,000 pounds?
Yes.
Okay. John Cumberbatch has a question.
Are these ships these days still using magnetic compasses and sextants?
Very good question. The answer is yes. The magnetic compass is required on all ships because they're all going electronic charts, as I mentioned. But electronics can go wrong, and you must have a magnetic compass. You must still run a deviation table, and they're doing that. Sextants are still required, again, for the same reason. So they need to know how to use a sextant and have one on board.
So these containers that do go overboard, is there any talk about putting a GPS locator on those?
I have seen it. They've been talking about that, but the problem is you'd have to do, which one's going to go overboard.
Yeah, right. So, the cost to put one in every container is the issue you're saying.
That's the problem, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
We who could hit them think that's not as big a problem as they might.
Always perspective.
Exactly. Where you stand has a lot to do with where you sit. And so, what do you do after you graduate from, when you want to retire from being a shipping guy in the commercial shipping business? What's your next gig? What do people do in retirement?
A lot of guys and gals like to come ashore and have a normal family life. It sounds romantic, but when you're gone 6 months at a time, and you come home, and it's really hard when the kids come along, and you miss the walking, the talking, and the first time, and it gets tough. So a lot of people come ashore and work for as I said in that one slide, shore organizations. I came ashore to work for Mobil Oil Corporation and Hess Oil, and lived all over the world. In addition to Australia, lived in Switzerland, Gibraltar, and so I've seen the world. That little boy on the St. Lawrence Seaway, I wouldn't have changed a thing. It's been fabulous. So there's also, I love doing this for kids in schools and things like that. It's just another thing to think about as you're getting, as another career opportunity.
So as we all know, here inside the grill room of the St. Francis Yacht Club, 50 or so folks here, there are usually 700 folks out in the Ethernet. Some of those have questions. And Julia, we have a couple more questions from the Ethernet.
2 more questions. How common is finding contraband?
It's not common. You normally don't find it on the ships. Not to say that it's not there.
How often per year?
I would not know. That would be something for the Customs and Border Patrol. I run into those guys all the time after they've been on board, and everything's fine. Everything's fine. One thing I do find interesting that a lot of people aren't aware of is they'll run the containers through a huge X-ray machine. So over in Oakland, you'll see the truck driving through this big U, and it's like, what the heck is that? And it's an X-ray machine that they're running through. But I just don't know the answer to that, to give a definitive answer.
And why are so few vessels registered under the U.S. flag? Brendan Badley.
Cost and liability, normally. Taxes are less. You don't have the liability that you could have in the U.S.
Which country has the most lax regulatory?
Ooh. There's some flags I really don't want to say, but as I said earlier, my preamble is you can look on the list for blacklisted flags, and there's your answer. just type that in Google.
One last question from the audience. Yes, sir.
You mentioned a lot of ports and facilities in the Bay Area. Are there tours available for any of those?
Oh, sadly, no. Back to liability, how are you going to have a tour? The closest you can get for the container terminal is to drive in there, and there's some overlooks that you get a pretty good view of what's going on, and the public can go there. from a tanker's perspective, that the Benicia Bridge on the Benicia side, you can drive right up there, park and have a little walk, and you look right down on top of a tanker or a barge. That's as close as you can get.
You want to meet Terry Klaus, Staff Commodore here at Art Yacht Club. He once provided my wife and I with a tour over in Alameda, and it was amazing. 6 containers a minute, and I mean 1 every 10 seconds, would come off of the ship when we were watching it. So it's well worth a tour if you can persuade Staff Commodore Terry Klaus to get a tour for you. I want to thank you, Craig Thomas, for just a very thoughtful and informative talk at the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon. And with that, the luncheon is adjourned. Good on ya.
Thank you.
Wonderfully informative.